How could scattered towns, separated by forests, oceans, and stubborn opinions, ever imagine standing up to an empire that commanded ships, soldiers, and laws stretching across the world? It seems unlikely that farmers, merchants, and craftsmen would challenge rulers who spoke with centuries of authority and carried flags recognized on distant shores. Yet history often begins with imbalance, where power appears solid while resistance seems fragile, inviting the question of how strength can hide vulnerability. As we step quietly into the story, the contrast sharpens because order promised safety, while obedience slowly demanded more than comfort could provide. The empire believed distance guaranteed control, assuming colonies depended too deeply on protection to question decisions made far away. What the empire underestimated was how daily life quietly teaches people what feels fair and what slowly begins to feel wrong. Along the coasts and inland roads, colonial life unfolded with routine rhythms as ships delivered goods, fields were planted, and towns gathered around markets, churches, and meeting halls. People followed familiar rules, paid expected taxes, and respected officials because stability felt valuable after long journeys and hard beginnings. However, decisions increasingly arrived from distant offices, written by people who never felt local winters or heard local complaints. The storyteller notices this distance growing heavier, like a shadow stretching across ordinary conversations. Colonists discussed prices, laws, and limits with growing curiosity. Questions replaced assumptions quietly. The empire framed control as protection, arguing that armies, fleets, and governors ensured safety in a dangerous world. At first, this logic felt convincing, especially when threats loomed beyond colonial borders. Yet protection demanded payment, not only in money but in obedience and silence. Rules multiplied, inspections tightened, and trade narrowed. What once felt like guidance began to feel like restriction, comfort shifted into concern. Systems designed to manage vast territories relied on uniformity, treating diverse colonies as identical pieces on a distant map. Local needs mattered less than imperial efficiency. Taxes funded wars that colonists barely understood. Laws changed without local voices present. The storyteller walks through these moments gently, observing how frustration often grows not from hatred, but from feeling unseen. Fairness became a frequent topic. Meetings grew more animated as neighbors debated policies over long evenings, balancing respect for tradition against growing discomfort. Pamphlets circulated slowly at first, then eagerly, turning reading into participation. Ideas moved faster than ships, crossing town borders with ease. Some colonists defended loyalty, warning that disorder invited danger. Others argued that loyalty required mutual respect. The disagreement itself became educational. Imperial officials responded with confidence, assuming firm enforcement would restore calm and remind colonies of proper roles. They increased presence, believing visibility equaled authority. Instead, uniforms and checkpoints made power feel closer and more intrusive. The storyteller senses tension tightening because reassurance and intimidation often look similar from above, yet feel different below. Trust weakened quietly, expectations changed gradually. Economic pressure sharpened the conflict since trade restrictions affected livelihoods directly and immediately. Merchants calculated losses, farmers felt squeezed. Workers listened carefully to debates once ignored. Daily survival connected politics to personal experience, complaints gained urgency. Colonial identity slowly shifted as people realized shared challenges created shared interests across regions. Differences remained, yet common grievances linked conversations from ports to villages. The idea of cooperation felt unfamiliar, but tempting. The storyteller smiled slightly, noticing how necessity encourages imagination. Coordination appeared possible, unity felt experimental. As arguments intensified, symbols gained importance because flags, slogans, and gestures offered shorthand for complex ideas. Supporters and critics recognized each other quickly. Public spaces felt charged with meaning. Still, many hoped reform would come without rupture. Negotiation seemed preferable, patience lingered. The empire held confidence and experience, trusting that previous unrest elsewhere had faded once authority asserted itself firmly. History, however, rarely repeats comfortably when conditions shift. Colonies had grown economically and culturally confident, education expanded discussion. Communication accelerated coordination, old solutions felt outdated. Security measures increased, justified as precaution, though they unsettled everyday routines. The presence of soldiers altered streets and conversations, fear mingled with anger subtly. The storyteller observes how safety arguments sometimes create the very instability they aim to prevent. Emotions grew complicated, certainty thinned. Local leaders emerged unevenly, some cautious, some outspoken, all navigating uncertain ground. Authority no longer belonged exclusively to imperial offices. Trust redistributed unpredictably, responsibility expanded without clear instructions. People practiced decision-making aloud, participation felt new. This early stage held no clear endpoint, only widening awareness that relationships had changed permanently. The empire still looked immense, the colonies still seemed small. Yet beneath appearances, habits were shifting, expectations realigned quietly. The road ahead stretched forward, unwritten, inviting choices that could no longer be avoided. As momentum gathered, everyday routines began to feel fragile because people sensed that familiar streets and schedules now carried expectations that stretched beyond survival toward participation and responsibility. Meetings grew larger and louder, yet still imperfect, as disagreements surfaced alongside excitement, proving that shared power required constant effort rather than simple enthusiasm. Some voices called for patience, warning that sudden change could invite chaos, while others argued that waiting only strengthened unfair systems already cracking under pressure. The storyteller walks through these crowded rooms, noticing how courage often trembles before it steadies, especially when neighbors realize their words might soon carry consequences. Authority reacted unevenly, since some leaders listened carefully, hoping compromise would preserve stability, while others dismissed demands, believing control depended on firmness rather than dialogue. Each choice reshaped events because acceptance encouraged participation, while resistance sharpened resolve among those who felt ignored. The tension between order and voice finally reached moments that could not be delayed. Public actions expanded beyond talk as marches, petitions, and assemblies filled spaces once reserved for ceremony or commerce, turning ordinary locations into stages of shared intention. People learned quickly that visibility mattered because silence allowed systems to appear unquestioned, while presence reminded rulers of the governed. Symbols grew bolder, carried proudly yet cautiously, since open defiance risked punishment even as it inspired solidarity. The storyteller senses fear mixing with excitement, recognizing that bravery often feels like uncertainty rather than confidence. No single plan unified everyone, but a shared direction emerged, shaped by experience rather than theory. Momentum continued unevenly. History rarely moves smoothly when many hands push together. When confrontation arrived, it varied in form, sometimes appearing as heated debate, sometimes as refusal to obey unjust rules, and sometimes as sudden clashes triggered by misunderstanding or mistrust. These moments tested commitment because ideals sounded inspiring until tested by real costs. Families discussed risks around dinner tables, weighing safety against dignity. Young participants often pressed forward eagerly, while elders measured memories of past failures. The storyteller listens carefully, knowing every perspective carries truth shaped by experience. Movement matured through disagreement, unity grew more resilient through strain. Institutions felt pressure to adapt because systems designed for control struggled to respond to participation without transformation. New rules were proposed tentatively, often clumsy yet sincere. Councils expanded, votes replaced appointments, and representation slowly took shape. These changes felt symbolic at first, but symbols influence behavior when repeated. People practiced new roles, learning to argue respectfully and decide collectively. Mistakes occurred often, learning followed immediately. Not all outcomes met hopes since power does not dissolve easily, and new leaders sometimes repeated old habits. Once responsibility settled on their shoulders, disappointment arrived alongside pride. The storyteller notes this honestly, understanding that progress rarely erases human weakness. However, even flawed systems preserved an important shift because removal of voice became harder to justify once granted. Citizenship remained active rather than decorative. Expectations adjusted permanently, history changed direction. Stories of these moments traveled far, inspiring others who felt similarly constrained. Some borrowed methods, others adapted ideas to local customs. The pattern repeated unevenly across regions and generations. Not every attempt succeeded, yet each attempt left traces. Rulers elsewhere paid attention, sometimes reforming preemptively to avoid unrest. Ideas proved contagious. Fear spread alongside hope. Over time, participation reshaped identity because people no longer saw themselves solely as subjects, but as contributors to collective life. This shift influenced education, law, and culture quietly. Children learned that authority could be questioned respectfully. Debate became a skill rather than a threat. Civic responsibility entered daily language. The storyteller smiles gently at this change. Power learned to share space. Conflicts persisted because shared decision-making exposed differences rather than hiding them. However, exposure allowed negotiation to replace silence. Compromise gained value, responsibilities spread wider. Freedom felt heavier yet more meaningful. People accepted this weight gradually. Participation became habit. As generations passed, memories softened into stories, sometimes simplified but never fully forgotten. Ceremonies replaced urgency, yet lessons endured beneath tradition. The storyteller reminds listeners that power remains fluid, shaped continually by attention and action. History does not end with victory. It pauses briefly, the future listens carefully. The people remain essential.